Right, I would like to welcome everybody to this very special occasion in our calendar. It's going to be, I think, a really rich afternoon. So welcome everyone who is here with us in person, but also everyone that's online across the world. And it's wonderful that we've got many of Ben's relatives, particularly in North America, who are going to be part of our occasion this afternoon. I'm Tony Kushner. I'm in Parks Institute. I'm the history department, and I'll be chairing this afternoon. We've got 4 short presentations. And just before we start, I was talking to Helen earlier. We've known each other for, we worked out rather scarily, 45 years. So just about getting to know each other. I think we were undergraduates at Sheffield University from 1978. And we were sort of talking how in 1978, it would seem remarkable we would be here today for this occasion, and how strange and wonderful that is to commemorate this wonderful archive and wonderful man. I won't say much about the archive or Ben's life, because this is going to be, and this significance and wider context, because this will be dealt with our presentations. So we're going to set the scene, first of all, with Ben's widow, Helen Abeles, who is going to talk about Ben the person and get us going. Helen.
Thank you, Tony. I'm going to talk about Ben's life and what he was like as a person. A tough call in 15 minutes. Because no other family members can be here, I'm speaking on behalf of all of us. When people asked Ben where he came from, he would generally say Prague, as he felt that's where the formative years of his childhood were spent. It also felt easier than explaining the twists and turns of his life, which meant that he didn't feel like he really came from anywhere in particular. His life up to early adulthood was one pushed in different directions by huge political events of the time. In fact, he was born in Vienna in 1925, although at the time, the family was living in Bielsko-Biała in southern Poland, close to Auschwitz. His mother, Selma, was Austrian, and his father, Arnost, Czech, a managing director for Stock Cognac. And he wasn't born Ben, but Fritz. Name changes, along with being washed along by the tides of history, are another theme in Ben's story. His parents were assimilated, but he remembered the family experiencing the anti-Semitic atmosphere in Poland. Otherwise, life there was very comfortable. But in 1933, the first great change for Ben came when the effects of the Great Depression reached Central Europe and Arnost lost his job. The family decided to move to Prague, as that's where his father had connections. In Prague, the 8-year-old Ben felt like an outsider, a Polish-speaking Jewish boy in a non-Jewish Czech school. In spite of his parents' assimilation, Ben still felt Jewish. At this point, he started calling himself Bedřich, the Czech version of Frederick. By his own account, he was a wayward child and an out-of-control teenager. But he did form a close circle of friends. In many ways, it was a wonderful time as he and his mates roamed freely around the streets of Prague, getting into all kinds of scrapes, unaffected by the growing Nazi threat. Ben remembered first the sounds, and then as he looked out of the window, the sight of the German tanks rolling into Prague in March 1939. This then was the next cataclysmic event that was to sweep Ben's life in a totally new direction. His parents found out about an Englishman in town who was helping children to leave. His mother took him to a hotel in the center of Prague, where they queued for hours to get his name on the list for the Kindertransport. That mysterious Englishman was, of course, Nicholas Winton, although Ben only found out who he was many years later. A £50 guarantee, a lot at the time, was required by the British government, and Ben's uncle Charles in Paris put up the money. Charles and his wife and daughter were murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau in 1942. For the 14-year-old Ben, Leaving for England on his own was an exciting prospect. Even so, the emotional scenes of parting at Prague's main railway station, and in particular his mother's contorted crying face, were indelibly etched into his memory. This was July 1939. And time for another name change. Bedřich becomes Fred. Ben's time in England was not typical for Kindertransport refugees. He was placed in a boarding school, but he didn't like it, and they didn't like him. He ended up on his own in London, working in kitchens and then a series of short-term jobs, dodging the German bombs and sometimes sleeping in the tube station air raid shelters. At first, letters flowed freely back and forth between Ben and his parents. After they were moved into Prague's Jewish quarter, keeping in touch was more difficult, and letters would pass through friends in other countries. From mid-1941, before his family was transported to the Terezín ghetto, brief messages could only be exchanged on Red Cross forms. The last one he received was in December 1941, informing him that his sister had got married. After that, there was silence. As he later found out, his parents and sister were transported from Terezín to the extermination camp of Trauniki, and his brother-in-law to Majdanek, where they were murdered. In May 1943, just before he turned 18, Ben joined a Czech squadron attached to the RAF, where he became a ground mechanic. Apart from giving him a feeling of belonging, he was encouraged to study and so completed his University of London matriculation, equivalent of A-levels. Getting his certificate was the happiest moment of his life so far. When the war ended, the Czech servicemen were flown back to Prague. Ben was in his uniform with only a small knapsack, intending to return and take up a place at university in London. But in Prague, he found his best friend from school, Marcel Neumann, and his family, who had survived and returned to their shop in the old Jewish quarter. It was a joyous reunion, and the Neumanns persuaded Ben to stay, effectively adopting him into the family. A Christian family member had been left a box of family documents and photos, now in the archives here. A trip to the Ministry of Education office in his RAF uniform, waving his University of London matriculation certificate, even though the Czech equivalent was of a much higher standard, secured him a place to study at Charles University. And time to ditch Fred and go back to Bedřich. Ben described the post-war years in Prague as some of the happiest of his life. He threw himself into studying science and enjoying himself, managing to bury the trauma of his parents' disappearance and the lack of information about what had happened to them. However, in 1948, a big political upheaval meant yet again Ben left everything behind and was off to start a new life. There was a Soviet-inspired communist putsch in Czechoslovakia, and suddenly a different kind of anti-Semitism was rearing its head. And Ben, now with a master's degree in physics, was worried his career prospects would be limited, having lived in the West. So in 1949, he and the Neumanns declared themselves to be Zionists and requested exit visas for the newly established state of Israel. None of them actually were Zionists, but this was the only way out of communist Czechoslovakia. In Israel, Ben first worked waiting tables, but eventually landed a research job at the Weizmann Institute, a prestigious scientific institution. They sponsored him to do his PhD, which he was awarded in 1956 from the Hebrew University. This was the opportunity he had dreamt of, even though he never took to life in Israel, having to learn a new language with no biblical study to help him along, and contend with the extreme heat. And since no one could pronounce Bedřich, he became Benjamin, a name he stuck with for the rest of his life, although he preferred the shortened Ben. In 1956, he was offered a postdoc position at RCA, Radio Corporation of America, in Princeton, New Jersey. So Ben was off again, although this time by his own choice. Even so, another big political event was on his heels. He was on one of the last flights out before everything closed down when Israel and Egypt went to war during the Suez crisis. At last, he was stable, spending 53 years in Princeton. In 1958, he married Anne, herself a refugee from Vienna, and they had 3 children, Rebecca, Susan, and David, and he became a US citizen. In the late 1950s, Ben did his most important scientific work, culminating in the radioisotope thermoelectric generator, achieved with his colleague and friend George Cody, which enabled exploration into deep space. The invention was patented by RCA and sold to NASA. In its way, it was also connected to wider events in the world, as this was the height of the space race. Ben maintained an interest in energy generation, and at the Exxon Labs, where he moved in 1977, he worked on solar. When he retired in 1995, Anne had become ill, and he devoted himself to caring for her, which he did with utter dedication. He also found time to throw himself into volunteer work with the Trenton Area Soup Kitchen. A brief spell as a teenager living on the streets of London engendered in Ben huge empathy for homeless people. In 2008, during a spell at a language school in Mexico, Ben met me and ended up moving back to England in 2009, almost 70 years to the day from his arrival on the Kindertransport. The defining event of Ben's life was, of course, the Holocaust. However, he said that it was not until much later in his life, after retirement and Anne's death, that he really dwelt on the immense suffering his family would have experienced and the horrific nature of their deaths, even though he never found out the full details. During my time with him, he told me he thought about this every day. The immense sacrifice of his parents in sending him away drove the hitherto bad student and difficult teenager to make something of himself. And this drive was what enabled the world to benefit from his and George Cody's generator for space exploration. The experiences of being a refugee and a migrant and the close personal proximity to the horrors of racial persecution gave Ben a huge social conscience and questioning of oppressive political stances. In Leicester, he became a volunteer translator for newly arrived Roma families from Slovakia and campaigned with the charity Safe Passage for safe legal routes to the UK for today's young refugees. Having to fend for himself from an early age gave Ben an immense adaptability, but I think also the freedom to keep reinventing himself and be adventurous. This carried on his whole life. How many 83-year-olds pack up house and move continents to be with a new partner 35 years younger than them? Although he was frustrated by the limitations and pains that age imposed on his body, he would often comment that it was an interesting experience and would delight in the things, however simple, he was still able to do and enjoy. As he once commented to my sister about his newly acquired walker, "I'm glad I've lived long enough to need this thing." His attitude was that change is inevitable and better embraced than resisted. Ben's life experience taught him that most material possessions are inconsequential. The items he really valued are the ones here in this archive. Survival from the age of 14 depended on connecting with people, and he derived huge pleasure from others, whether it was someone met at the bus stop, his family, or his many close friends. A few months before he died, Ben completed and self-published his memoirs, feeling compelled to finish them in spite of failing health, so that his story would be out there for future generations of his family and the world at large. The details of how to get hold of them are up on the screen now, and there are some flyers here in the room if anybody would like to know how to get copies. I hope this whistle-stop tour has enabled you to get a feel of the man behind the documents in the archive.
Thank you very much, Helen. And I had the privilege of meeting Ben briefly when in Southampton there was a sort of theatrical recreation of the arrival in a train station. And Southampton was one of the major places where Kindertransportees arrived. Not Ben in Ben's case, but it was a very powerful drama, but also very powerful to meet Ben. And I should have added in terms of introducing Helen that she mentioned her connection to Mexico, but she'd done human rights work in Central America and now co-runs a very important center, Soft Touch Arts, which engages young people in creative activities. The way we're going to organize it is have questions and comments after the four presentations. So I now pass on to Karen Robson, who is the archivist and who is looking after Ben's papers. Karen has been the archivist here for some time and has developed this remarkable collection of material, including its very, very rich and varied Jewish archive material. And Karen has cared for this collection, helped its conservation and catalogued it with enormous professionalism. So we owe a huge debt to Karen, and including this most recent and important collection. Karen.
Thank you. We can go to the next slide, please. So the Archives and Special Collections, the Archives and Special Collections at the University of Southampton is the home to extensive Anglo-Jewish archive collections. They now amount to nearly 4 million manuscript items, mainly from the 18th to the 21st centuries, but our earliest item is from the 1200s. So this makes Southampton one of the largest repositories of Jewish archives, not just in the UK, but in Western Europe. Next slide, please. The collections that we hold are those of individuals and families, organisations and communities. They cover a wide array of subjects encompassing all facets of Anglo-Jewish life from many different points of view. Areas covered also include Palestine and Israel, the Holocaust, migration and refugees, Jewish communities across the globe. And we have here some examples from those collections, including over here, one of our refugee collections. Collections of individuals include those of Cecil Roth, of Cecil Brodetsky, private papers of one 19th century chief rabbi, that's Adler, and two 20th centuries ones, Chief Rabbi Hertz and also Chief Rabbi Brody, material for Neville and Harold Lasky and their parents, members of the Henriquez family, including Sir Basil Henriquez, papers of the performer and writer David Kossoff, correspondence of Frederick Dudley Samuel from the front line in the First World War, sermons of Rabbi Abraham Cohen, papers of Sir Robert Whaley Cohen and of William Frankel, a wonderful set of letters between Mrs. Joseph and her sister Lady Samuels from the 1920s and 30s, papers of Lady Swaddling, and a very recent addition is the papers of Rabbi Jonathan Maginot. We also hold an array of collections of a whole range of other individuals that provide a fascinating insight into many aspects of Anglo-Jewish experience. Two very different collections shine a light on communal life in London and also in the provinces. The 45 volumes of the Journal of a Minor Anglo-Jewish Communal Official, kept by Samuel Rich over a period from 1904 to 1949, are an eloquent commentary on the development of the Jewish community in London. Also relates to the Jewish Free School, where he taught, and on national and international events. In contrast, the papers of Trudy Dubb, who was a Jewish refugee from Czechoslovakia, who arrived in the UK in 1939 and then settled in Leicester, from where she acted as the Leicester correspondent of the Jewish Chronicle for over 40 years, provide a contrasting view of the outside the capital. The experience of Jewish refugees in Great Britain in the 1930s is documented in, among others, papers of the Adler family from Vienna, which include papers of Sigmund Adler, who was the brother of psychologist Alfred Adler, who were befriended by a Christian couple, Cecil and Joan Stott. Papers of the Van der Zeel family, which include material of Rabbi Werner van der Zeel, which relates to his time in the Moran internment camp on the Isle of Man. Archives of organisations similarly encompass a vast spectrum of activities within the Jewish community, including philanthropy and social work, education, women's rights, religious practices and observances. The Jewish Board of Guardians, the London Board of Shehita, the Anglo-Jewish Association, the editorial correspondence of the Jewish Chronicle newspaper, the Union of Jewish Women, the World Union of Progressive Judaism, and the Reform Synagogue of Great Britain, Jews College, Youth Aliyah, and the Jews Lads, Girls and Girls Brigade are just some examples. We also have papers of pressure groups such as Conscience and the 35s, which is a women's campaign for Soviet Jewry. The library also holds extensive material for the Institute of Jewish Affairs and the British section of the World Jewish Congress, the latter of which provides an invaluable resource for the situation of Jewish communities in Nazi-occupied Europe during the 1930s and 40s. Within the archives of Rabbi Solomon Schoenfeld is a large section of material relating to the work of the Chief Rabbi's Religious Emergency Council and the rescue of members of the Jewish community in the 1930s and 40s. This collection represents one of the most extant collections of such material for Jewish refugees that exist in Great Britain, and it is complemented by a series of papers relating to refugees found in the archives of West London Synagogue. Taken as a whole, the Jewish Archives collections at Southampton provide a rich and extensive source for the study of Jewish history, telling a range of different stories. Next slide, please. And information on these can be found on the online archive catalogue, the link of which can be found here. Next slide, please. I'm going to apologise if I pronounce this surname wrong. Ben Abeles collection is what we would term a relatively modest size collection in quantity, but quantity is no reflection of quality. Each collection, like each person, tells its own stories, but there are resonances between this collection and other material within the Anglo-Jewish collections that we already hold. These include migration and refugee experience, the shadow of the Holocaust, the binding ties of family and family connections, the power of education, and the pursuit and achievement of excellence within a particular field. Next slide, please. The collection is composed of 3 boxes of personal and family papers, 4 boxes containing a series of correspondence, one more personal in nature, the other a series from 1950 to 39, relating to Ben's professional career, 2 notebooks and loose papers of scientific notes, 3 photograph albums and 17 folders of loose photographs. There is a mix of personal and family images as well as one celebrating Ben's career and achievements. So that's just a little sample. Next slide, please. The material tells the story of a Central European Jewish family in the early half of the 20th century, whose lives and fates are overshadowed by the Holocaust. Photographs record a united family in pre-war Poland and Czechoslovakia, supplemented by some of his parents and sister and her husband for the period from 1939 to 41. And here are some of the family photographs, including one of the wedding of his sister and her husband. And next slide, please. Precious letters exchanged between Ben and his family also date from this period, the last being those sent by the British Red Cross, and there's an example of one of those. Next slide, please. The collection documents the experience of the young refugee and migrant who travelled to the UK in 1939 on one of the transports arranged by Nicholas Winton. And here we have a photograph of Ben and Helen and Nicholas Winton at the premiere of, what's it called, Nicky's Family, the film that's in 2014, I think. Yeah. After attending school for a brief period, Ben tried his hand at a range of jobs as well as sleeping rough before joining the Czech squadron of the RAF as soon as he turned 18. At the same time, he worked on his English and took courses to study for matriculation at the University of London. Next slide, please. But it's really the period after the war that we have the larger concentration of documents, shedding some light on Ben's academic studies and his distinguished career, as well as his family life in the US and later in the UK. the scientific correspondence with fellow scientists worldwide, a series of outgoing letters during his time at RCA laboratories, his notebooks, press releases, and publicity of scientific developments, next slide please, and citations and photographs relating to awards exist in parallel with the more personal, such as details of applications for visas and naturalization, of purchases of properties, photographs of his wedding to his first wife, Anne Singer, and of his family and his retirement party, or slide 12, next slide please, his list of records for his Desert Island Discs choice, which I think is lovely. Next slide please. The Ben Abeles collection represents a welcome addition to the archives and special collections at Southampton, enhancing and complementing material that we already hold, and in particular strengthening our knowledge of the Kindertransport and the experience of migration. Archives are in essence records created by the activities of people and represent the stories of their lives. The Ben Abeles archive presents a new and strong voice, telling the story of his life and work, adding to the chorus of voices whose stories and collections we already hold.
Thank you very much, Karen. Karen mentioned the Chief Rabbi's Emergency Council, CREC, and I remember at the event we had in Southampton Station, where it was recreating the arrival of the children, someone was playing the role very, very well of a sort of very snobbish, overpowering refugee organizer, and we had to be the sort of people waiting for the children. And she said in a very sort of supercilious way, none of you would know what the CREC stands for, would you? And I couldn't help myself. It's the Chief Rabbi's Emergency Council. She was totally floored. And he was like, how the hell did you know that? But there you are. I never volunteer for sort of pantomimes or other things, but I couldn't stop myself there. Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you for all the brilliant work you've done over the years, but particularly with Ben's wonderful archive. It's a great pleasure now to turn to Nicola Woodhead. And Nicola, just about, I think, 2 weeks ago, got her PhD in history. She's very much a Parks Institute product. She did her undergraduate degree with us, an MA in Jewish culture and history, and now just her PhD, which is looking at the Kindertransport, and especially transmigrancy and movement within the Kindertransport, and Nicola will say more about that. She's also been a superb member of our outreach team, going to schools, colleges, adult education, and we are very much hoping as Nicola moves on that we will keep that expertise and brilliance in outreach work. Nicola also, I've only recently found out, is a women's footballer and has just recovered from concussion. So if anyone has an idea that women's football is sort of gentle little game, Nicola can tell you otherwise. Nicola.
Thank you, Tony, for that rather glowing introduction. So thank you both to our speakers so far, Helen and Karen, who have outlined a bit about the Kindertransport and particularly Ben's life and what this archive brings. And so I'm going to focus particularly on the part of Ben's life that was the Kindertransport and try and situate his life, his experience and his journey into our wider understanding of the Kindertransport. So if I can have the next slide, please. So the Kindertransport was a scheme that allowed 10,000 predominantly Jewish children to come to the UK. But there were a lot of caveats to that, rather than it being a simple, open-ended, humane scheme. So children had to come unaccompanied. The plan was that they would not remain in the UK, that they would eventually emigrate or return home when it was safe to do so. As we know, many ended up staying in the UK, but the Kindertransport was grounded in this expectation of re-immigration. And Ben's life really does show that Kinder were not static. They didn't remain static in the UK, and they didn't remain static throughout their life. So this aim of immigration is very much embedded in the scheme. So children were separated not only from their parents, but also from their siblings. If I can have the next slide, please. And although this was very much embedded in the scheme, there wasn't much clarity over when these children would leave. So there were, in the Houses of Commons, there were debates over, oh, how are we going to keep track of these children? They are essentially aliens coming into the UK. And equally in the press, there were reports asking, these children, when are they going to leave? And detailing that by the age of 18, they would certainly have left the UK. So if I have the next slide, please. So within the UK, our narrative is very much around the arrival. So we look back at the children when they came to the UK, and this sort of creates a bit of a safe narrative that we can lean into and say, these children were granted asylum in the UK, and this is a wonderful British tradition. But a lot of our understanding of the Kindertransport in the UK doesn't go beyond that. And as we have already heard today, that these children's lives did not end in the UK. They ended up migrating. They moved within the UK. They did not always have a very smooth period settling into the UK. So if I could have the next slide, thank you. But these are two of a few of the memorials we have in the UK. The one on the left is at Liverpool Street Station, and the one on the right is a newer one at Harwich. And both of these celebrate the arrivals of children. So we can see them sort of looking to a new life. They may be looking back, looking at the children, their siblings that they left behind, the parents that they left behind. But on the whole, we're very much looking at, a UK-centric understanding. These children have arrived. In particular, the Liverpool Street Station is called The Arrival. And I always think of it more of an arrival, because this was not the end point. There were many more afterwards. If I have the next slide. But the one on the left at Liverpool Street Station is one of a chain. So it's 5 memorials around Europe. And it shows and commemorates the journey to the UK, but we have nothing of the journey away. Thank you. But as I said, from the very start of this scheme, the idea was that children would re-emigrate. Originally, the Kindertransport was envisioned it would be maybe 5,000 children. They would be able to come to the UK, and as children left the UK, more children would be able to be brought to the UK. And children were arrived in reception camps, particularly those who first arrived in the early arrivals. They were children who had already been placed in concentration camps after Kristallnacht. So this is the context in which the Kindertransport operated. So as I've said a few times now, re-immigration is very much at the heart of the Kindertransport, but it wasn't just imposed on them. Children looked to return home. They wanted to be with their family. They wanted to find their siblings, and organisations did seek to find out when these children were planning to leave, particularly as more children who emigrated, the more children that could be brought to the UK. And then during the Second World War, whilst re-immigration slowed down, it certainly did not end. So you had the deportation of individuals who had been classified as enemy aliens. You also had a few who were able to secure visas and travel permits, who were able to leave. And one of the documents on the right-hand side details that actually 896 children were able to leave in 1940. And this is on top of the approximately 1,000 children who had been interned, and then 400 of those were deported. So the Kindertransport has this global reach, and I think this is really seen in the 50th anniversary of the Kindertransport. So in 1989, when they tried to get together an organisation to celebrate and commemorate the Kindertransport, ads went out in newspapers around the world, trying to find Kinder, to try and find where these individuals had ended up. And this is a very small sample. So we've got some in the Canadian news, in South Africa, in Israel, in America, and around Europe. And 1,000 children came and attended this memorial in 1989. And since then, sort of knowledge of the Kindertransport has ever increased. And then I just want to turn now a bit more to talk about Ben Abeles's life as well. So the next slide. So his journey, I'm not going to reiterate what Helen has already said, but you can sort of see, I have very crudely mapped his journey around the world. It's not a journey of being static. It is not simply he was someone who came on a Kindertransport, came to the UK, although he did return. It shows that, you know, that Kinder were on the move. If I have the next slide. And it shows that Ben's life was very much part of a whole. So this shows more Kinder and their journeys around the world. And it shows that, you know, if we have like the ability to have a glimpse into one Kinder, which this archive does, this collection does, it shows us the rich and like the individual aspects of these Kinder's lives. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicola, and I'm sure you'll agree that it's very good paper, and if you don't agree, Nicola will break your leg after the conference. I've been lecturing for close to 40 years now, and I'm used to sort of ad-libbing, but I was slightly nervous until about 1 minute to 4 when our final speaker extremely promptly turned up, because there are certain things I just could not do. And I will read Charlie Ryan's brief bio, because none of it makes any sense to me, but it's very, very impressive. He's associate professor in astronautics, specializing in research and development of low-cost micro-propulsion systems for small spacecraft, with particular expertise in micro and mini electric propulsion, in particular electrospray thrusters, and also low-cost small Hall effect like thrusters, and a growing interest in small chemical propulsion systems, particularly using hydrogen peroxide. Last night, I struggled, the night before, struggled to get the television to work and had to get my 24-year-old to come down 3 times. So that's sort of the gulf in knowledge and expertise we're talking about here. But thank you very much, Charlie, for agreeing to put Ben's work into a wider context.
There's no problem at all. I will do my best to explain kind of technical achievements. I have to say, as maybe kind of got the feeling there, that I'm a propulsion guy for space stuff, and Ben's achievements are in the sort of well, in the material science world really, and then it's been applied to providing power in space. When it comes to details, you'd have to ask an RTG guy what that is about. You'll learn what RTG means in a second. So next slide, please. So this is Ben receiving the Ballantine Medal kind of thing. But what did he receive it for back in 1979? If you go to the next slide, he received it for stuff related to this. So this is a lump of plutonium. So as you might know what plutonium is, it's not particularly the nicest stuff ever. It's a lump of very dangerous radioactive material. Ben's research was related to this, and its end application came into using and relating to this. How it's related is because these produce heat. These produce heat, and you can use that heat to power a spacecraft. As far as my understanding goes, Ben had nothing to do with a lump of plutonium, and maybe never even saw a lump of plutonium, but he developed the method to take the heat from the plutonium and convert it to electrical power. And the way he's done it is in something called a radioisotope thermal generator. So that's this thing that called this RTG, radioisotope thermal generator, RTG at the top there. And that looks like, if you go to the next slide, looks like this. Looks so complicated and technical, and it kind of is in many ways. But in a simplistic way of viewing this is a lump of fissile material, and the fissile material, the lump of plutonium, is radioactive decaying, and that's producing heat. Ben's contribution is converting that heat into electrical power. And the way he does it is use thermocouples. So if you've ever played around in your garage or something like that, a thermocouple is a little wire that measures temperature. It converts heat into power. And you can see all these thermocouples all arranged around this lump of plutonium here. And that's what these unicouples, these silicon germanium unicouples are doing. And so in our lab, we have lots of these thermocouples. We attach them to a little thermocouple reader, and we go measure temperatures around the place. And it converts the heat into a power, into a voltage, which is calibrated to a temperature. The thing that Ben managed to do was the stuff we use to measure this in our lab is really bad at efficiency, really bad at converting this thermal into electrical power. Ben's kind of contribution here is to develop these new types of materials, this new kind of PN junction out of silicon and germanium from the semiconductor industry. So in the 1960s or so, then around that time, people are developing semiconductors, silicon chips, you know, all the stuff in your phones that provide all the circuitry. At that time, then there was lots of interest in new materials related to silicon chips and looking and applying them in different ways. Ben's work there took silicon and germanium, used that clever new material from silicon chips to basically in a new type of this thermocouple, this new thermal to electrical power conversion system. And yeah, it does get very technical, and I had to look at the paper. So if you go to the next slide here, this is one of his papers. So this is from 1962, and it's probably the main one out there. I found this on Google Scholar, so it's still you can very quickly kind of access it. It has hundreds and hundreds of citations, even up to the modern day as well. So the last citations from papers out there, and sort of a couple of years ago as well. And you can see it's all about taking this clever new alloy that he developed along with his colleagues, Cody in particular, I believe, and using those to convert the heat out of this lump of plutonium into power. It sounds quite niche and is quite niche, but there is this really useful thing in terms of it in these radioisotope thermal generators. It's a really useful application there. Those have been used a huge amount on spacecraft in a very particular way in spacecraft out there. Next slide. This is I believe Ben himself testing this. So you can see on the left-hand side there, in a little vacuum chamber, I think, a little glass vessel, is his heat source, and on that is one of these silicon germanium thermocouples that's converting the heat to electrical power, and he's driving this little electrical fan of it. That's his kind of little test there to demonstrate that it kind of produces an output power. Cool. Next slide. So what do we use it for in space? What do you use these RTGs for? Well, it's probably the coolest examples of space exploration out there. This is the reason why it's so useful in really specific scenarios is demonstrated by this. It's not a photo, unfortunately. It's a render, CGI thing. This is a picture of what it would look like if you're on one of the moons of Uranus and looking towards the sun. So you can see that white dot there, that's the sun. And at this distance, so Uranus is, I can't remember, is it the 8th satellite, the eighth planet? I think so. It's really far away from the sun. And that means the sun is so much weaker at that such far distance. So suddenly there is no way to get any power from the sun at the far distances away. And so you have to look at other methods to get power. All spacecraft are just boxes with solar panels on the side when we're close to the sun. When we're really far away from the sun, we have to think about new methods to do that. And that's what these RTGs are really useful for. And there's some really cool examples of the best spacecraft missions ever really use these RTGs. So if you go to the next slide, the most famous of these is the Voyager probes. You may have heard of the Voyager probes. They got launched in the late 70s and then did some swing-bys around the planets to build up some energy and went to Saturn, I think, and Jupiter out there. And so a lot of the outer planets swinging by each one of them in succession. there's no sun out there. There's no light to power these. And you can see this is a picture of the Voyager probe. There is no solar panels on this thing. There's no big flat panels. Instead, what it's got on there is one of these RTGs that provides a power to allow you to operate this spacecraft. And if you go to the next slide, you can see it in place here. So the RTG is this little stick on one side of this radioactive power source. They're not very powerful. They're really kind of, no one uses them in other situations close to the sun, where you've got lots of sun, because solar panels are pretty good these days if you might have them on your garden roof or whatever, on your house or whatever. But in specific scenarios like this, they're still, many decades later, they're still the power system of choice. Yeah, and Voyager's still going. It's now the furthest object away from the sun. It's into interstellar space. One of the most famous spacecraft ever, along with Voyager 2. And this is continuing. There's the New Horizons probe that flew past Pluto a few years ago. Big NASA mission that also uses an RTG as well, radioisotope thermal generator. And one other really nice example, if you go to the next slide. Oh, this is a beautiful picture of Voyager. This is the famous pale blue dot image. This is probably one of the most famous images in space science history. And this is taken from near Neptune. And Carl Sagan, you might have heard of, a famous kind of space scientist, he decided to point Voyager back towards the Earth and take a picture of the Earth. And so that little white dot there, that isn't the sun in this case, that's a picture of the Earth. And so, you know, a tiny little white dot is where all we are, all sitting there inside that little white dot. So this was taken using the Voyager 1 spacecraft in 1990, one of the final things it did on its main prime mission. Okay, and then the last slide here, this is a nice new example of these RTGs are also being used in slightly different scenarios as well. So this is the Perseverance Mars rover. You might have seen this on the news a couple of years ago when it landed on Mars in a crazy Martian landing with rockets and stuff like this, and a sky crane, all this crazy stuff. Dropped down this huge rover. It's about the size of a reasonable sized car, and drives around on the Martian surface very successfully. And of course, it's also powered by RTGs as well. You know, it provides a good power source, and on Mars as well, sometimes the solar sun is not available for various reasons. So really interesting kind of application. We're taking the material science world and applying it to these really cool missions, and enabling the technology essentially enabled some of the coolest space science missions ever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlie. I mean, it's brilliant how you've described that, and I can understand it. I'll talk to you about my television set later, but I think it also just shows what remarkable achievements Ben and his colleagues made. We now have time for discussions, comments, both from the people with us and also online. If you want to put your comments in the chat, we can. Claire Lafol, Director of Fox Institute, is here to sort of find them. Again, my technological prowess will help. I don't want to embarrass Claire by being so tech savvy, so I'm leaving it to you. Any questions from the room or from those with us across the world online?
I have one question.
Oh, Hilary, did you want to say something?
Yeah.
Wait.
Yes, I do have a question for the presentation, for the historian one. You know, the one particular thing that that caught my attention. I'm a linguist. Is the use of the word alien. You know, like foreign. You know, like alien. It seems like that word. You know, like even though it was used. You know, during a long time ago, you know, at the time when, you know, Ben was, you know, Ben and the children were, you know, going to England and to other places. the word alien was being used. And it seems like in our time, like immigration is still used to demonize, other peoples. And so I guess my question was, so what do you think about, what is the experience that we have, from the experiences of Ben, and in the children that fled Eastern Europe, with similar situations that we are living today. I'm here in Texas, same thing, like family separation. It seems like things have not changed. So so my question is, what are some of the lessons that history and Ben's experience can bring to bear, can teach us about how to deal with our continuing immigration problems nowadays? Thank you.
I mean, I will start and then offer to the panel. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that language is critical. We've had a big debate in Britain very recently about use of language, and it's been left to an ex-professional footballer, Gary Lineker, to point out parallels with misuse of language over migration, for which he got a lot of flack, but also an enormous amount of support. So I think that's a very positive sign. Term alien is totally neutral, legal term of being a non-citizen, but its practical cultural use is negative. Used very little today, but we use different terms. Asylum seeker has become a term of abuse. Refugee, even refugee has been seen as a sort of negative term rather than something that gives people a sense of people needing support and help. But migrant has become a problematic word. So whatever term is used, however neutral to begin with, it's been weaponized, and that is part of the way. But then Ben's experience shows that these are human beings. Some of them will contribute hugely, others will have ordinary lives. And it was said of the very well-respected, famous children's author in the UK and beyond, Judith Kerr, who came as a child refugee, that who wrote The Tiger Came for Tea and Hitler Stole Pink Rabbit, that if she'd only written a note to the milkman, that would have been enough for us to let her in. You don't let refugees in because they're going to become brilliant scientists like Ben. You let them in because it's the right thing to do. Could I just offer it to the panel?
Yeah, I echo Tony's thoughts as well, but equally I think as well, when we're thinking about the Kindertransport in particular, I think you asked about like what lessons there are, that the Kindertransport is imperfect. The fact that, as you said, it's a child separation scheme. Children are still being separated at the moment. Like I think of some of the schemes when we talk about like the Syrian Kindertransport, although it was, to bring children to the UK who already had families, there's still that element of child separation that remains, like family separation, and we shouldn't be judging these people, what do they bring, or have they already got family here? We should be just trying to provide more humane refugee policy in general. I don't know if anyone else has any comments, or if you want to hand back for another question.
We have a comment which I think you can read hopefully online from Susan Pearson. Ben also said to me that he wanted to go on having whatever adventures he could physically manage. And Susan is...
That's my sister.
Oh, your sister,
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah, I'm forgetting the Pearson. Yes. So, question at the back.
It's a much less profound question. It's more a practical one about collections management. It's probably a question for Helena and Karen. But apparently there's a question of what archive and what to give. And an archive's point of view, I think on the content, you have to decide what you're going to collect. Process matching Ben's legacy with this institution. Think about that.
I'll just quickly repeat the question if it wasn't, because we haven't got a roving mic, of what was the process of giving the material to Southampton, selecting the material, and
And selecting the archive,
That's-
because there are archives in Europe and America and Israel, but why this archive?
so why Southampton?
Yeah, so I can speak to that question. So actually, very soon after Ben died in December 2020, his son David initiated a conversation with me about his papers and whether we could donate them to an institution where they could be used for study, as an illustration of the Kindertransport refugee experiences, and also to celebrate in a way his scientific achievements. And I very much agreed. So most of the material was in my possession because it was he brought it to Leicester. And between us, we looked into different options. Just sort of to cut a long story short, the reason why I recommended Southampton and Ben's children agreed is that we felt it's a very important Jewish collection, very highly respected within Europe, very well used by scholars and researchers and students. And so as Tony mentioned, we've known each other for 45 years. So when we had an initial conversation about it, he said, well, why don't you come and meet Karen, see the archive. And when I came here, I was really impressed by not just about the facilities and the fact that I felt that the things would be on a technical level really well cared for. I felt a warmth towards them receiving this material and that it would be cared for and cherished and crucially used by Tony's students and other members of the history department and other academic students, researchers. And that was very important to me personally, because it's kind of a strange thing to give, the early things are extremely precious items. They were extremely precious to Ben, obviously. Some of the things that we saw, like the photographs, the Red Cross letters. Ben moved around all over the place when he lived in England. And then he went back to Czechoslovakia, he went to Israel, he went to the United States, came back to England. He kept those with him. They were his most precious items, really. And it was just that feeling of that here the things would be valued, cherished, used. And that's really why I chose Southampton.
Excuse me, thank you. You're quite correct. We do get offered quite a lot of collections. We obviously consider things on a case-by-case basis to see how they fit within the existing collections that we have. But I should say that we take very seriously our commitment to continue to enhance and support and develop the collections that we have here to ensure that the stories of the Jewish community and is kept for posterity. So we are always very delighted when people approach us to discuss with us the possibilities of collections coming here. Obviously, it is the case that we have to consider if we are the best institution for housing this material, and there can be cases where there may be instances where we think that it might actually complement collections elsewhere. We go with the principle of something we call critical mass, in the sense of having material that fits together, that complements each other. And I was talking about the chorus of voices that tells a sort of story. So we have a great deal of material that relates to migration and refugees. We don't have so much on scientists at the moment, or refugee scientists, but it fits very well within a narrative. We are very committed to ensuring our outreach programs, our teaching and academic programs, and supporting those. The academic programs have developed very much as the collections have developed. So there are all those factors that we consider when we're looking at whether collections would fit in with what we have already at Southampton. And we felt very much that this was a very good fit, and we were delighted to take it. Thank you.
We've got a question at the back and then Neil at the front. So please.
Thank you. You mentioned the adventures that Ben wanted to have in his later life. So going back to Charlie, the question is, to what extent was Ben able to continue the adventure that his technology, RTG, NASA, he actively involved with NASA?
I don't know. I don't know. No.
So the question was, just to try and summarize, was he part of the later journey of his remarkable contributions? And I think the short answer is no.
No, I mean, the invention was patented by RCA and sold to NASA. And from Ben's point of view, he then moved on to do it to other scientific endeavors. And I would say he was, he kept up with developments of how it was being used. Karen briefly showed the playlist of his Desert Island discs. And the last track on there is Mars, from Holst's Planet Suite, and that was illustrated with a picture of, actually it was the Curiosity, which was the first Mars rover. And I think he felt very chuffed and amazed, actually, that this invention from, it was 1959, sorry, that him and George, really did this work. But he moved on to other things. He worked on early development of solar, for example. He was interested in energy generation, but in terms of the work with space and NASA, no, he didn't have any further involvement.
Neil.
Question of the choice of archive and what it means for how we frame someone's work. In reading the material here, there are obviously foregrounded in Jewishness. If one checks the foregrounded as distinguished scientist, that might have a choice or taking us in a different direction. And it's probably was that magic himself. It was really interesting how you described that towards the end of his life, he immerses in humanitarian work, the requires sense of spirit. So the own life, powerful in all the ways that we understand. And in between, you've just got to distinguish career. And it can't think of wonder how it's all the forties and twenties. You give himself a family Jew, identity.
Okay, so what my friend he's saying is that how did Ben identify himself, particularly in this sort of intermediate period of his, particularly in part of his career, as Jewish, refugee, scientist, humanitarian, or what, and which Neil was relating to sort of choice of archive, that the archive could have gone to a more scientific archive, or one which has a different type of focus field. So Helen.
That's quite a complicated question, which I'll try and do my best to answer. I didn't meet Ben until he was 83. So by that time, he'd been retired for quite a long time. But he did tell me that he wasn't interested in physics anymore. He didn't particularly keep up with things in the world of physics. He had very close friendships with colleagues, one of whom is here today, somebody that Ben worked with at the Exxon labs in Princeton. But he wasn't particularly interested. It was almost like sort of, I don't know, he wanted to move on what he'd achieved. He was extremely driven to achieve, and he was extremely driven by being fascinated by science. You know, from an early age, that's what he discovered when he finally applied himself to study. It was science. But I think in later life, he did develop different identities. Now, he'd always been, well, I don't know about always, but in his later life in the States, he was politically engaged. I mean, he talked about going on anti-Vietnam peace marches and things like that. But it was after he retired, and then particularly, I think, when he was starting a new life, yet again, that he began to identify much more actively with being a refugee, having been a refugee himself. And so I mentioned the organisation Safe Passage. So Ben became involved in that organisation, and he spoke at the House of Lords. He spoke at Leicester Cathedral. We had events, and what he felt, I think, very much was that he wanted to bring his experience into the debates around how we should be treating and receiving refugees now, particularly unaccompanied young people. He also, as I mentioned, that he was, passionately committed to this organisation in New Jersey, Trenton area soup kitchen, and he had a particular empathy for people living on the streets. I mean, he knew a lot of the people in Leicester who were on the streets. I mean, it was amazing. And he was always a very physically active person. And that was an incredibly important part of his identity, actually. And he talks in his memoir about going up into the mountains in Czechoslovakia as a young person, and into his early 90s, he was swimming several times a week, and that was an important part of his identity too. And obviously his family. Yes, he moved, across the pond back to England, but he has 3 children, 4 grandchildren, 6 great-grandchildren, and that became part of his identity as somebody who had survived, and then the next generations kept coming, and he felt huge satisfaction actually out of that.
Okay, just as Helen was responding, we've had 2 further comments in the chat about his character and activities. Michael Abramov saying Ben also helped to found a soup kitchen in Trenton, New Jersey, which is, I think, Helen was just saying that as Michael typed that. David Pollock, his sense of humor was always ready. For example, he joked about not wanting to be a professional Kindertransportee. So thanks for that. And we have a question from the room, please.
Yeah, just a couple of questions about the general questions about the Kindertransport. Was it completely open as much as anyone who could join the transport, or was there some sort of cap on the numbers? And related, really, have you had any been able to view any of the governmental discussions that went on at the time to see the extent to which the transport was contentious?
Okay, just to repeat for that, particularly for those online, in terms of the scheme, was it sort of open to anyone if they could pay or people helping them to pay the fee, and were there limits on numbers? So Nicola, if you could respond, sure.
So there were definitely limits. So originally this was going to be 5,000 children, because although the UK government did not put a cap in place, the organisations and charities realised that there was only a finite amount of resources and who they could support. So they thought, well, we can support 5,000 children in the UK. If 5,000 come and 5,000 re-emigrate, there's another 5,000 we can help. But it ended up being around 10,000. And there were rather strict limitations on this. So the children had to be fit. They could not have disabilities or impairments. There were a few charities where they did support. So the Berlin Deaf School, children from there were able to come to the UK, but it was very much not a, if you can pay, you can come. You had to be able to get on a wait list as well. There were queues with children's parents trying to get them a place. And they could be judged not fit to come to the UK. They were subject to medicals when they arrived in the UK, so they had to be able to pass those to be able to be granted a place. And then your second question was about governmental documents. So there is a fair bit of contention in some of the documents. I briefly alluded to one in my presentation where a MP sort of rather facetiously asks, you know, if we allow these to come, like, will the Chinese come too? Sort of rhetoric we're very used to seeing in the press today. And I think that sort of just speaks to the fact that, you know, although we look at like the Kindertransport as, you know, relatively people wanting to support these children, with hindsight, there were those voices as well then that were quite prominent, that were in the House of Commons, saying that, you know, we shouldn't really be supporting these children or refugees in general.
And just to add to Nicola's comments, as a bearer of very little brain, I couldn't work out why there's so little material in the National Archives relating, and of course it's because it's not a government scheme. The government enables it, but it's not a government scheme, it's a private scheme, which the government allows the visa sort of waivers or partial waivers. So there's there's a remarkable parliamentary debate, but there's almost nothing in the Home Office files, Colonial Office files, and so on, because it's not, and it's represented as a government scheme. The plaques towards it in the House of Commons, Liverpool Street Station, almost imply, not even apply, say it's a government scheme, which it isn't. We've got two more comments in the chat from Susie Abeles. He had an option in his early career, Ben had an option in his early career to leave RCA to become a physics professor in Colorado or Chicago, but stayed in the private world of research. A loss for students, as he was an intuitive teacher with immense passion and a superb sense of wit. And David Pollock adds, among his many abilities was languages. He was studying Hebrew until he died. He met Helen on a Spanish course in Mexico, and he enjoyed speaking German over coffee. He was such a delightful companion. We've got, I think, two more questions from the room, and I think we probably have to bring this to a close. We're slightly overrunning, so if we could take the two questions in the room.
Young museum curator, research within the National Archives, and as an early 20s Anglo Jewish girl, it was the first thing that stabilised my sense of stability and community. Letter from the legacy so and request for very elegant and written note on it. Saying after an opportunity, and I think that was the first time I had a real sense of the establishment. Quite right, this kind of playing this children that sense of the extent which the in which politics very senior level.
Again, trying to summarize for the people online who couldn't hear of how that immigration procedure mentality predates the 1930s, of how a sort of major concern about adding to the Jewish population of the UK and coming within discourse within the elite Anglo-Jewish community as well. If you final question, and
maybe I should withdraw it because it's the wrong tone. I'm a complete outsider here, but I am puzzled by this Abeles as an adolescent. I can't find anybody who says anything bad about him as an old man. He seems to be absolutely delightful and fascinating. But one looks back at him in the period that we begin to see, from age 14 to 20. He says he flunked his last year in school in France. Comes here and he lands up in Maidenhead and more or less storms out, decides, I think it's Mr. Williams' head he hates. This is a kind of confidence that is not entirely sort of positive usually. So there's a side to him which says, I don't put up with nonsense for very long. I'll go and have fun with my friends or whatever. But it's not cockiness in a bad sense, in that he then goes and works in fairly menial positions, and at some point turns the corner and decides, sees the light and says, I've got to do some work. Now, this is a complicated picture. He's not just a nice man, he's much more interesting. Fair?
Okay, again, trying to summarize a very reminder of the terrible one-liner. It's nice to be important, but more important to be nice. And that Ben was perhaps more complicated than just a superb scientist, very, very humanitarian man, but also was a sort of feisty teenager, even before becoming a refugee. Helen, do you want to?
Yes, I mean, of course, he was complicated. I think we're all complicated. There's a lot of us that were maybe very different as teenagers to what we became as adults. And yes, as Ben relates in his memoirs, he was a troubled teenager. I sometimes think he's maybe the kind of troubled young man who would be referred to my organization by a social worker. He's a bit out of control. He's been expelled from school. His parents are despairing of, what's going to become of him. And that was going on for him. He had very contradictory feelings about having been sent on the Kindertransport, because obviously that was because of the danger that he was in. He really respected enormously his parents' courage in letting him go. But he also said that in many ways it was the making of him, because suddenly there he was, having to live on his own resources and his own wits and discover who he was as a person. And he was quite troubled as a child and a teenager through feeling like he didn't fit in anywhere. As I've explained, the family moved from Poland back to Czechoslovakia. His mother was a German speaker. She never learned Czech. He initially went to a Czech school with non-Jewish students, and he felt like an outsider there. When he went to the Jewish school, he felt like an outsider because he hadn't had a Jewish upbringing. It was that feeling of not fitting in, really, that he himself said kind of fed into the rebelliousness and difficulty in settling down, really. And although coming to England, that was another upheaval, and he didn't fit in because he was a refugee and he was on his own, he didn't have parents. But actually, that, as I said, I think that actually that experience brought out who the real Ben was. And that was somebody who did want to make something of himself and to study, and was interested in science and wanted to have a family and do all those things. So it was a process of development.
Very, very quick question.
Very quickly, I'm the chap who works at Jersey, but my comment, nothing to do with more silicon, so anything like that. It's the apparent gap that you noted. For being now, I saw quite a lot of that. And Ben was really invested. We got together very quickly. And we shared a lot of his reminiscences. And I can assure you, it was my almost troubled teenager. I was one that I think I wish my teenage years had been his. I was wondering if I was ever going to find it. Ben was
Magnet.
but he
The magnet. So
he was just magnetizing. Probably enjoyed the air raids when he was working at a parents' hotel because Nick all the staff would go down and Gloucester Road Tube station, trying to get to sit next to one of the chambermaids, Mary, and she would cling to him when the bombs came down and trying to stand up for skill. I don't want to tell you anything more than that. But that's a whole other pharmacological history and other things. And he was a hell of a guy. As well as a hell of a physicist. You'd have known in my life.
I think I'll just summarize it with the last sentence of that Ben was a hell of a guy. And I think that would be an appropriate moment to sort of bring it to a close and to thank everyone involved. First of all, behind the scenes, Katie, who along with Nicola has been at the forefront of Parks Institute outreach work over the last few years. Katie is another sort of Parks product and is a superb example of what we are trying to achieve. To thank Katie very much, to thank Claire, who is coming to the end of her tenure as director of the Parks Institute. She's been brilliant, as we've heard this afternoon. Neil Gregor will be equally brilliant and is going to be taking over in a month or so's time. So it's a bit like Doctor Who in transition. We've got the two doctors, the two directors in the room at the moment. I'd like to thank very much everyone that's been with us in the archive and in this session today, and especially those that have tuned in from across the world. It's wonderful sort of byproduct of the horrible COVID pandemic that we've been able to sort of develop parks in a sort of blended way, especially through sort of Katie's technical expertise, and reached a really huge international audience, which is exactly what James Parks wanted when he set up his centre. So I think we've sort of honoured that in a very unusual way, and again, technology being to the fore. I'd like to thank our contributors, Charlie for doing the impossible of describing these incredibly complex things in a really straightforward way that was engaging and exciting. Nicola for setting this wider context. Karen for her ongoing superb archival work, which as Helen said, is done not just with professionalism, but with love and sort of empathy for what she's working with. And finally, and most importantly, to Helen, long-standing friend, but for making the decision to send the material to Southampton to donate the material, and for her contributions today. So thank you, Helen.
Thank you so much for having the idea and really organizing, thinking this event and sharing.
Thank you. And I think we have some
Tea, coffee,
refreshments.
cakes outside. Yeah,
Okay.
please.
Excellent. So enjoy it outside.